Welcome to Life on the Other Side, stories from prisoners, their families, and those helping them find justice and redemption with Alec Klein. This podcast is sponsored by Republic Book Publishers, which brings you books tackling the important issues of the day, and the new book Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over, by Alec Klein. For more information, please check out republicbookpublishers.com. This is part 2 of the podcast with Lynn Christopherson, whose ex-husband, Dave Woodward, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison before he was later released on probation.
In 2015, not many people went to the parole board hearing.
That's
Hardly at
for
all.
sure.
Many times I was the only one in the room, and I was staying all 3 days. And I remember the chairman coming up to me, Vanessa Price, when I stayed past the business meeting, she came and sat down with me and wanted to kind of find out, who are you? So as I continued doing that month after month, I remember people saying, so what are you doing? And I said, I'm reforming the pardon and parole process.
Literally. And by the way, did you have the 3-ring binder at this point that you brought with you?
Yes. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. It's an impressive set of documents.
They have an agenda, and then they have the various parole dockets, commutation dockets, and I'm a data person. I believe that if you can see, I was looking for patterns. And so I would document the vote, and I'd pay attention to who voted first and in what order they voted, and just finding out how they review the material. I have spreadsheets looking for patterns, how best to present the material, how best to get a face on Dave in front of the board.
Little do people realize how valuable that can be. Although I have to say, I would assume the pattern for the most part back then, and we're talking about just a few years ago, was essentially no, no, and no.
Yes.
For the most part. So, because I've sat in that same room as you have. But so, how did you actually make progress, Lynn? What was the secret to breaking open a case that, on paper, I mean, let's face it, my recollection, having reviewed some of the records, is that this was like hand-to-hand combat. I mean, and it led to, we don't have to go into the grisly details, but it was quite up close and personal. This is not like other cases that I've reviewed where the crime occurs from some distance, with a gun, perhaps. I mean, this was literally death, in close quarters, involving, I think, if I'm not mistaken, rope and a knife, right?
Yes.
Among other things.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But Lynn, how in the world did you make progress here? Tell us what you did to open these prison gates.
Well, Dave's first parole hearing in 2012, there was a lot of focus on the details of the crime, which disconcerted him because he wasn't prepared to retry the case.
Right. And
it was discouraging for me to hear. And so after 2015, the board did change a little bit in their focus, but it occurred to me, again, how to help the board see Dave the human, not the distant individual who did this horrible crime, but how to see Dave as human and think in terms of it is a job application process in a way, and so things like, and paying attention to the questions they were interested in. Can he support himself? What has he done to be as current as he can with how things work out in the world? And so, just little things I think that make a difference, like on the front page of the packet was a picture of him at his workstation, at his computer workstation. Again, thinking details are important, I think, showing that he knows how to work a computer, or at least that's what the picture says.
Interesting. So pictures tell 1,000 stories.
Pictures tell 1,000 stories. The other thing was, how are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to pay your deposit for your apartment if needed? He'd worked very diligently at at saving money. And so he had the last page of his inmate bank statement that showed how much money he had in his account.
So it sounds to me like you were both practical because you were trying to show that if he was granted parole, that he could be a viable member of society with a job and with a plan. But it sounds like you were also humanizing him so that they could understand that he was just a person who deserved a second chance.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. And another piece that I did was because the DA had protested mightily the first time he appeared, actually showed up in person. Part of attending the parole board hearings when I started was I discovered, I know when the DAs are going to do their protests and I can be present. And part of my plan was the next time Dave came up for a parole hearing, I was going to be present on that Monday afternoon so I could hear and see what the DA was saying. But it occurred to me, part of my planning was that the big hurdle, like you said, is that first jacket review. And DAs, that's the hurdle. And so I actually contacted the district attorney's office. I found out he was going to be appearing at the Pardon and Parole Board, and I just stopped him briefly, said I'd like to visit with him about an individual coming up for parole. And he was going to listen then, and I said, you're a busy man. May I send information to you? So I sent the parole packet, and my ask of the DA was, would you write a letter of support for parole, or at least write a letter saying you didn't oppose parole, and do it by the jacket review stage. I followed up one time, but I didn't follow up afterward. This particular DA can get kind of testy. I just didn't want to push it. And all I know is that there was no protest. There was no written or verbal protest.
That's remarkable. I mean, as you know, prosecutors often, not always, but often want to preserve their convictions, that hard-won convictions, and for this prosecutor to not stand in the way of Dave regaining his freedom, that's remarkable. What do you think was the key to persuading the DA to sort of stand down?
I don't know. The prosecuting attorney in Dave's case was Bob Macy, who has a checkered past at best. I don't know if that played into it. Maybe he looked, I sent him the parole packet. Maybe he looked at the parole packet and said thought he was good with that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
One thing that strikes me about your journey and your sort of Hail Mary attempt to get Dave out of prison is that in a sense it feels almost like a love story, that you were so devoted to his case and to his freedom. I mean, it was, to what extent was what you were doing a matter of your love for Dave and wanting him to have a life again?
Oh, that was a huge piece of it. Because regardless of what happened to our marriage, he still was the person that I knew and will always love. You can love someone and recognize, you know what, we can't be together. And I think, my Christian belief comes into that too.
Well, I wanted to ask you, it's funny that you mentioned that, but it feels like it's right there, the issue of faith. I mean, from the beginning, in a sense, you were a deacon as you described it, but even more than that, it requires a certain level of faith to do what you did, to get married, to fight for his freedom, to, talk to us about your faith and how that played a role in all of this.
Oh. Wow. Kind of on a psychological level for me, my view of the world is nothing's impossible. It just may take a little longer. And my faith tells me that I used to think I was very, very, very bright at figuring out how things were going to play out, what was going to happen, coming up with a solution, how to make it happen. But I have long since learned that, you know what, somebody else can do much better than I can at that. God. And so I don't want to limit the possibility by telling God, well, this can't happen. You know, and the biblical story that just weaves throughout my experience, this whole experience, is the story of the importuning widow before the judge. You know, you just keep asking. And for Dave and I, it was because he tends towards pessimism, and I tend towards optimism, as you've probably figured that part out. and you know, as things were unfolding this last time, he would ask me, he says, people around here are all telling me, oh, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. This guy's in prison. And he would say to me, he said, what do you really think is going to happen? Is this going to happen? And I said, it sure feels like it. I really do. I believe it will happen. We just have to do the next step, you know? And
what was that?
The next step each time along the way when he called me, he started calling me before the board meeting, was his jacket review vote didn't happen till like 4:00 in the Monday afternoon. So you, having been to these meetings, know how exhausting that is.
Right.
And so he started calling me about 3. And anyway, so I was headed back to Tulsa, and he called, and he had heard, oh, no, that was for the personal hearing. This was when I told him that he got 4 yes votes for the jacket review. He was just dumbfounded, and that's when he began, do you really think this is going to happen? I said, it sure looks that way.
Now, what year was this?
This was he's been out a year, 2018.
So he gets through that crucible of the first stage, and then he manages to get through the second stage, the personal appearance stage as well, right?
Right, and of course a piece of this too is that his personal appearance was in December, in early December, and he's also got an interstate compact that's got to be worked out, and the governor won't sign his parole certificate if the governor agrees until that compact is in place and the season, and then we've got a new governor coming on board. And so Dave's thinking, well, Fallon is the one who's going to say yes. Whoever the new governor is might not say yes. And so he was very, very concerned about that. Certificate didn't get signed until March the 8th, I believe it was.
By which governor? By
Governor Stitt. We had no feel for his attitude on paroles.
Right. Although he campaigned to a degree on criminal justice reform.
He did, yeah.
But you never quite know until they're actually in office, I suppose.
And they tend to be a little skittish at first, a little conservative, because it's an incredible process, as you know.
Right. So at what point, Lynn, did the governor sign that piece of paper that finally gave Dave his freedom?
Like I said, it was March the 8th, I believe.
Of
2018. No, 2019.
Right. So it's only been a little more than a year, right?
Yes.
I mean, so what was your reaction, and what was Dave's reaction to this kind of unbelievable situation where he actually got his freedom? Going from life without parole to having the governor signing a piece of paper saying you are free.
It was pretty amazing. It was exhilarating. It was a lot of pinching ourselves all the time. When I went to pick him up, and even at the very end, it was because there's so much. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. When you leave a facility, you have to, it's kind of like leaving high school. You have to make sure all your library books are turned in. You have to clear this office and that office. And that Monday morning, he was trying to do that, and he goes down to records, and they're saying, no, we have to get the governor's certificate. And Dave, fortunately, had the copy of the signed parole certificate that I had mailed into him the week before to say, you mean this signature? And they were like, oh no. And they had to really rush to get him out before the effective date.
So tell us about that moment when you picked him up at the prison. I mean, I've experienced that moment when an inmate has been set free before their sentence is up. It's a bit of a surreal experience. But what was it like for you and for Dave in that moment? Can you bring us to that moment?
Yes. Well, there was the sally port with glass walls between us. He's in the visiting room with a dolly with all his stuff piled on top of it. He's waiting for his debit card with his earnings on it, and saying some of the other guys were there saying goodbye to him, and the one inmate who actually was the law clerk that got him his post-conviction relief. There's tears in their eyes, and I'm waiting, and I remember driving out. So we get all his stuff loaded. He had to stop and go back in and come back out to the sally port so the warden could take a picture of this event because it was so momentous for him. And I remember driving off of the grounds with Dave in the passenger side of the front of the car. I just kept looking at him going, I can't believe this, and he would say, would you please keep your eyes on the road?
He wanted to make his freedom last for a while, is what you're saying.
Last for a while. And,
beyond the car ride.
Yeah. And that first day was such a blur because there were people in Norman that he wanted to. We had breakfast with the priest that married us, and then checked in with a good friend who was actually the guy who walked me down the aisle, as it were. And we went. He needed a phone, and so we're thinking just a little. Go to Walmart, get some kind of burner phone, and I am not a technocrat by any stretch of the imagination. So we go into the Walmart store, and this guy as tall as Dave with a ponytail. We go to the electronics part, and I'm looking at all these options, and I'm going, oh no, I don't know how to tell this guy. So we asked the clerk, middle-aged gentleman, here's the deal. Can you help us? And he starts rattling off all this stuff, and Dave says, okay, let me give you a hint. Pretend like I've been in prison for 26 years. What would you suggest? And the guy kind of looked at him, ha, 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 and Dave looked at him and said, no, really. As he hitches up his baggy sweatpants.
Now, Lynn, it's been a little over a year since Dave got out. Tell us about what it's been like in the life after.
Well, he's doing well. It's not been what I expected. For the first month we anticipated. He lives in Maine. We were older people. We would figure out this marriage thing. We'd take it one day at a time and figure it out. And see what's what. And what for us is that Dave's in Maine and I'm down here, and we talk. I certainly wish him well, but we're not married. That's just not, there's a sadness there, but it's wonderful hearing what's happening with him. And I did have the chance to meet his family. So these people that I had been emailing and writing to and offering encouragement and suggesting, letters to write, I've gotten to meet them. And so I know Dave in a much fuller way now.
Yeah.
And we have wonderful, funny stories about our drive from Oklahoma to Maine in March. And someone who had been in prison for 26 years navigating the East Coast in New York City. I mean, we have priceless stories along the way.
That's its own crucible.
Yeah.
So when did the marriage end?
Well, when we went through the process of him getting his post-conviction relief, that was tortuous. That's when we discovered the bumps in our relationship. Communication is just isn't that usually where it's at? Right. And that's when we got formally divorced, and then we're able to reconcile and be in touch with each other. And Dave finally believing that I want him out, and my recognition that the best chance we had of reconciling was for him to be out.
But basically, he's out. What's he doing these days?
Well, his family has a redemption bottle center. Maine's one of these wonderful states that you have to put a deposit when you buy any beverage in a container. And in order to get it back, you have to return those containers to a redemption center. And you get that deposit back. And then the redemption center gets paid a fee for processing the stuff by the state.
Wait, I've got to stop you here, Lynn. Are you telling me Dave is in the redemption business?
Yes, he is. His
wow.
family business is the Empty Bottle Redemption Center.
That's amazing. Think about it. Dave received his own redemption. And what about for you? I mean, your marriage really spanned much of the time that he was actually in prison. But for you, how do you view this whole experience now that it's over?
Well, it's over and it's not, because I know the first time after I got back from my second visit to Maine in June, I went to a pardon and parole board hearing. Of course, everybody expected me to move up to Maine, and I knew that would be problematic because I have parents and I have grown children and grandchildren here, and Dave's family is up there. That was part of the working out, but this experience has been very particular in this one person, but also there's been a global sense to it. And so when I go back to a pardon and parole board meeting after Dave's gotten to Maine, people are surprised to see me there. And I'm going, he's not the only one that needs to get out of prison.
Lynn, I was about to say, do you still have the binder?
I do.
So the binder lives.
The binder lives. Oh, yeah. I don't keep as much data as I used to, but there's a couple of people that I met down in at Joseph Harp who have asked me to help in some way, and I'm still working on encouraging families, on helping them learn how to communicate with their legislators and get them there. I got my legislator to come. She was ready to take a letter to the governor's office if he turned Dave down. I'm still trying to help families become engaged in the political aspect of it, how encourage them to get to know their legislators, come to the pardon and parole board meetings, get to know these people, let them see you're paying attention.
Lynn, in other words, your journey with Dave was really just the beginning of your journey beyond Dave, which is you're still involved in helping people who are incarcerated, you're trying to, it sounds like, change laws. You're trying to help families get educated about the process. Is that all fair to say?
Yeah.
So is there any redemption for you in all of this?
Oh, yeah. A life well lived is a really rich and good thing. Yeah, the redemption is, there are some people that might look back on my 20 years with Dave thinking in terms of we were married and thinking, oh, you wasted 20 years. And I don't feel that, I guess because all of my life, how can my goal is, how can I be used by God? How can I be an agent of grace?
Right.
And Paul talks about one planting the seed and the other watering, and I'm very much aware, again, if you're going to be in this work, you have to have a multi-generational view. If you expect change in your lifetime, you will burn out. You have to have the long view and recognize that I don't know how this little action I've got right now is going to play out, but it's going to have an impact, and I have to trust that God can use it.
Well, Lynn, this is a beautiful story, and I have to say those 20 years don't sound wasted at all to me.
They don't feel wasted.
No, if anything, it's quite the opposite. I mean, you helped Dave be restored, and you are in the process of restoring others. What could be greater than that? So I really appreciate your sharing all of that with us, and thank you so much, Lynn.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the work you do.
Well, thank you, Lynn. It's I feel much the same way you do about all of this, being a servant, really.
This podcast is sponsored by Republic Book Publishers, which brings you books tackling the important issues of the day, and the new book Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over by Alec Klein. For more information, please check out republicbookpublishers.com. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next podcast involving stories from prisoners, their families, and those helping them find justice and redemption. And please subscribe to the Life on the Other Side podcast on iTunes.